I never believed the ocean could remember a name, but down in the Mariana Trench, I learned how wrong I was. The first time I broke one of the 11 rules they gave me, I felt something stir in the black water, something that knew who I was and whispered it back to me. They said the rules were the only way to survive in the depths, where sunlight dies and voices travel farther than they should. I thought they were exaggerating, but I was wrong. Now every dive feels like a gamble, and I can't stop wondering what happens when the creatures down here decide to call my name again. The labs inside the trench were built with reinforced glass walls so researchers could watch the abyss without leaving safety. But I was warned early on, Rule 1, never look directly into the observation windows after midnight. At first I laughed it off, thinking it was some initiation prank meant to spook newcomers like me. The rule sounded like a childish bedtime warning, a way of turning the darkness outside into a ghost story. But during my second week, when the station felt emptier than usual and the pressure creaked through the steel walls, I began to wonder if there was more truth in that warning than I wanted to believe. The first time I worked a night shift alone, the silence pressed against me thicker than the ocean itself. The hallways were dim, the overhead lights humming low to save power, and every sound carried further than it should. My workstation sat just across from the largest viewing window in the facility. The one everyone joked was our cinema screen to the void. I told myself I wouldn't look, that I'd focus on my notes, but my eyes kept drifting, curious, restless, and tired. It was just blackness, I thought. Nothing to see, nothing to fear. Then something passed, not close enough to make out details, not sharp enough to call a shape, but a disturbance, a darker streak across the already infinite dark. My heart beat faster, and I told myself it was a trick of exhaustion, maybe the reflection of my own shadow shifting in the glass. I forced myself to look back at the data, but my mind was already restless, building images from nothing. The worst part wasn't that I thought I saw something. The worst part was the feeling that the something had seen me too. When the clock ticked closer to midnight, I tried distracting myself by recording lab notes aloud, speaking into the mic to make it feel like I wasn't alone. My voice sounded strange, bouncing against the walls, and I kept glancing sideways, catching that vast black expanse in the corner of my eye. I remembered what Harris, one of the senior biologists, had muttered once while half asleep over coffee. "It's not about what you see," he said. "It's about what sees you back." I thought it was his way of sounding dramatic, but those words pressed heavy against me now. I broke my own promise and glanced at the glass. At first, nothing was there, just endless hollow black, like falling forever into a pit. But then, as the seconds stretched, faint outlines began to surface, as if the dark itself was sharpening into focus. My throat went dry. The outlines didn't look like fish or squid, not even like the predators we tracked. They looked more like suggestions of forms, drifting closer in slow, deliberate movements. And though the glass was thick and sealed, I had the impossible sensation that whatever was out there wasn't observing the lab. It was observing me. I blinked hard and jerked my eyes away, telling myself to stop staring. My breathing was loud in the quiet room, and I tried to count the sound of it just to steady myself. The rule hammered in my mind. Why would they warn us not to look unless something was there? I rubbed my temples and pressed my eyes shut, but even in the darkness behind my eyelids, I could picture the vague shapes crowding closer. The worst thought slipped into my mind without permission. What if they weren't outside the glass at all, but reflected from something standing inside the lab? The urge to check again was unbearable. Humans are built to look at what frightens them, to prove it's nothing. I turned just slightly, telling myself it was only for a second. The window was black again, empty, as if mocking my fear. Relief began to creep in, but it lasted only a moment. As I leaned back into my chair, I caught a subtle shimmer in the glass, not outside it but on its surface, like the suggestion of movement behind my reflection. My own face stared back at me, pale and tense, and behind my reflection was another one, darker, its eyes too wide, its mouth forming the shape of my name. I pushed the chair back so quickly it scraped across the floor, and the sound cut the silence like a blade. My hands shook as I slammed the monitor off, plunging the lab into deeper shadow, as though darkness could hide me from whatever was pressed against the glass. I didn't dare look again. Every nerve screamed at me to keep my gaze fixed anywhere else. I recited data, old nursery rhymes, anything to drown the sound of my pulse and the weight of something watching. The minutes crawled, each one stretching like hours, until finally the digital clock blinked past 1 in the morning. When Harris checked in on me during the morning shift change, I must have looked pale because he frowned and asked if I had gotten any rest. I wanted to tell him, wanted to ask what exactly was out there, but his tired eyes told me he wouldn't answer. Instead, he gave me a look that felt heavier than words, the kind that carried warning without explanation. I nodded back, as if to say I understood, though the truth was I didn't. I only knew that something had tried to meet my eyes through the glass, and it had known me by name. The rest of the week, I avoided night shifts, trading with whoever was desperate enough for overtime. But dread has a way of finding you, even when you hide from it. The schedule came out again, and my name sat firmly in the midnight slot. I stared at the paper in disbelief, my stomach twisting. This time, Harris wouldn't look at me when I asked why he couldn't swap. He only muttered, "Everyone gets their turn." His voice carried no malice, but it carried something worse, resignation. So here I am again, in the glow of failing lights, with the abyss pressed close against the glass. Midnight ticks nearer, and my resolve crumbles. I want to believe the rules are just superstition, that my mind played tricks on me before. But then I hear it, soft and deliberate, like a whisper threading through water. My name, not from a colleague, not from any speaker, but from the darkness itself, curling around me with familiarity. I shut my eyes tight, but I already know the truth. Midnight has come again, and the window waits. When I first joined the trench station, they told me casually about safety drills, oxygen tanks, and pressure doors. But when Harris leaned close one evening, his voice dropped to a whisper. He said, "Rule 2, never acknowledge the voices that call from the water," and I remember laughing nervously like it was some campfire story. But Harris didn't laugh. His eyes held the kind of exhaustion that comes from seeing something too many times and living just long enough to regret it. That warning settled deep in me, but at the time, I thought silence would be easy. I was wrong. It began during my 4th midnight shift, when I sat buried in microscope slides and notes, trying to keep myself distracted from the window at my back. I had headphones in, soft static playing just to dull the emptiness, when the sound cut out. Not abruptly, but as if something slid between me and the noise, like water filling a hollow. At first I thought it was a technical glitch, until I realized the silence wasn't silence at all. It was breathing. Slow, deliberate, too measured to belong to anything human inside the station. Then it spoke. My name, not whispered, not shouted, but spoken with a calm familiarity that froze me in place. The voice wasn't Harris or anyone else on the shift. It wasn't even coming from the comm system. It seemed to seep straight through the walls, as though the water itself carried it. "I know you," it said, and my chest tightened. I wanted to turn, to see if something stood at the window, but I kept my eyes fixed on the microscope. The rule played over in my head, loud as an alarm. Don't acknowledge it, don't speak, don't answer. The minutes stretched unbearably. The voice repeated itself. Always the same tone, always calm, as though it had all the time in the world. "I know you, I know your name. You're not alone." My lips trembled with the effort of staying shut, of not muttering something back just to prove I wasn't losing my mind. Sweat clung to my back, and the hum of the lights felt like it dimmed around me, replaced by that steady rhythmic breathing just outside the glass. I thought about plugging my ears, but I was afraid the act of reacting would count as acknowledgement too. Suddenly another voice joined it, this one sharper, almost mocking. It didn't repeat my name, it copied it, syllable for syllable like a child mimicking. "Usman," it sang, tilting the vowels until they sounded wrong, stretched too wide, too jagged. My body stiffened, and my throat burned with the need to shout, to tell it to stop. I gripped the desk until my knuckles whitened, trying to anchor myself, trying to remind myself that rules weren't suggestions, they were survival. If I broke this one, I might not live long enough to regret it. The worst part wasn't the voices themselves. It was the way they overlapped with the silence, the way they knew things they shouldn't. At one point, the calmer voice whispered the name of my hometown, a detail no one in the trench station knew. Then it whispered my sister's name. I felt bile rise in my throat. I wanted to call out, to demand how it knew, but my teeth clenched hard enough to ache. My breathing hitched, and I realized that maybe the voices weren't trying to scare me. Maybe they were trying to trick me into answering, into opening something I couldn't close again. Hours passed in that half-life between noise and silence, between sanity and surrender. When the shift finally ended, I staggered out of the lab without daring to look at the observation windows. Harris was waiting in the hall, his arms crossed, his eyes heavy with knowing. He didn't ask what I heard. He didn't need to. Instead, he muttered, "You didn't speak, did you?" I shook my head, though my jaw was still trembling. He just nodded once, a grim confirmation, and walked away without another word. But the voices didn't stop when I left the lab. That was the part no one told me. I heard them faintly in the showers, just beneath the hiss of water. I heard them in the cafeteria, hidden under the chatter of tired scientists. Always the same words, always the same rhythm. I know you, I know your name. They weren't just in the water anymore, they were in me, echoing through every quiet moment, waiting for me to slip. I started sleeping with the lights on, as if brightness could block them out. It didn't. One night, exhaustion got the better of me. I was lying in the crew quarters, half asleep, when the calm voice shifted. "Why do you ignore me?" it asked. Sharper now, edged with something like anger. My body locked, torn between sleep and awareness, and my throat moved against my will. I almost answered. The sound of my breath caught halfway to forming words, and in that instant, I knew if I spoke, even a single syllable, whatever was calling me would no longer be separated by glass and steel. It would be inside. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, clinging to the silence of my own unspoken words. When I finally rose, my reflection in the small metal mirror looked foreign, like someone else had borrowed my skin during the night. I splashed water on my face, forcing myself back to reality, but deep down, I knew the truth. The voices weren't just calling from the ocean anymore. They were waiting for the moment I slipped, and they weren't patient forever. That night, the voices grew louder, almost frantic, as if they sensed my weakening resolve. The calm one repeated my name again and again, while the mocking one dragged it into shapes that didn't belong to me. My hands shook as I pressed them over my ears, tears stinging at the corners of my eyes. The clock ticked closer to midnight, the air thick, my heartbeat pounding like it wanted to burst through my ribs. Then, just as I thought I might break, all the voices went silent at once, silence so sharp it felt like a blade. I dared to lift my head, just slightly, hoping maybe the night had ended. That's when I saw it. My reflection in the glass wasn't moving with me anymore. Its lips were parted, forming words I hadn't spoken, its eyes wide with something not my own. And though the room was silent, I swear I could feel the echo of my name on its mouth. The next warning came not from Harris, but from the station manual itself. A single line buried between maintenance notes and power guidelines. Rule 3, always keep the corridor lights on during shift hours. It sounded practical enough at first glance. Power failures at this depth could mean disaster. But when I asked about it, the senior staff went quiet. One engineer muttered something about shadows moving where they shouldn't, and another simply said, "You'll understand if you're ever unlucky enough to see them." Their silence told me more than their words, and the longer I worked here, the more I dreaded testing what happened if the lights went out. My first brush with that fear came when I was returning from the observation wing long after most of the crew had turned in. The corridor stretched on forever, a pale line of overhead bulbs casting sickly halos on the steel walls. Halfway through, I noticed one light flicker. Just a stutter at first, like the bulb was struggling, but then the glow sputtered into complete darkness. My pulse quickened, and I walked faster, telling myself the rule was just procedure. But the silence in that patch of black was different. Thicker, heavier, almost alive. As I passed beneath the dead bulb, the air temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the artificial chill, though the ventilation was steady. I tried not to glance sideways, but the urge to look was overwhelming, a primitive instinct warning me that something was keeping pace beside me. I caught the faintest impression of movement in my peripheral vision, like a shadow layered over another shadow, stretching long against the steel. I forced myself not to stop, not to blink, just to keep moving until I reached the light again. When I stepped back under the glow of the next working bulb, the air warmed instantly. The strange pressure in my chest eased, though my heart still raced. I turned back, expecting to see nothing but the stretch of empty corridor behind me. For the most part, that's exactly what I saw. But in the darkness where the light had died, I thought I glimpsed a darker outline, tall and bent, lingering as though reluctant to step forward. The moment I blinked, it was gone, but the memory of that shape clung to me like damp clothing. I didn't mention it to anyone the next morning, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I already knew what they'd say. The older staff had their own haunted looks, their own private encounters with the rules, and I wasn't ready to admit how close I'd come to breaking this one. Instead, I volunteered to help with maintenance checks, hoping maybe if I understood the electrical system better, I'd feel less helpless. But the electrician only shrugged when I asked why the lights failed more often at night. "It's not the power that's the problem," he muttered. "It's what waits when the power fades." Days passed and I avoided the corridors alone when I could, but one evening I had no choice. A message came through from the far end of the lab, and I was the only one nearby to retrieve it. The hallway stretched long and sterile, every light glowing in sequence. I tried to steady my breathing as I stepped forward, but halfway through, the lights behind me began to blink off one by one, like something was following and snuffing them out. The sound of my footsteps grew louder against the floor, echoing back at me too quickly, like there were more feet than my own. I broke into a run, shame burning hot in my chest, but fear sharper still. The lights ahead flickered, threatening to die just as the ones behind already had. And in that flicker, I swore I saw shapes crawling along the walls, moving in impossible angles, limbs too long to belong to anything human. My vision blurred with panic, and I nearly slammed into the steel door at the end of the corridor, slamming my ID against the scanner with trembling hands. The lights above hummed steady again, once the door shut behind me, leaving me gasping, my back pressed against the cold metal. Inside the room, I wasn't alone. Harris stood at a desk, staring at me with a look that was more pity than surprise. He didn't ask what I had seen. He only asked, "Did you keep running?" I nodded, unable to form words yet, and he sighed like he had expected no other answer. "That's the only reason you made it here," he said softly, turning back to his notes. "Never let the dark catch up to you. If it touches you once, it never lets go." I wanted to demand more, to know what exactly lived in the dark, but the weight in his voice silenced me. The station replaced the dead bulbs the next morning, but I noticed no one walked beneath them alone, even in daylight. They gave the darkness a wide berth, stepping faster as though superstition still held sway under sterile lab lights. I followed their example, though a part of me hated how quickly fear had trained me. Still, the memory of those stretched shadows lingered, and the echo of my own footsteps overlapping with something else haunted me every time I crossed a hall. The lights felt less like illumination now, and more like fragile barriers against something waiting just outside. The worst night came later, when a storm raged above the surface, shaking the trench cables and straining the station. The backup generators flickered, struggling to keep pace, and for a moment every corridor went black. I was in the center of one when it happened, trapped in total darkness so thick it felt solid, pressing against my skin. My ears filled with the sound of breathing, but it wasn't mine. It came from all around, shallow and hungry, growing louder with every second. My hands clawed the wall, desperate for the faintest trace of light. When the emergency lamps finally surged back, I wasn't alone. Just at the edge of the glow stood a figure, tall and bent, its limbs too many, its head tilted in a way that made my stomach lurch. Its body was made of shadow, yet its eyes burned faintly white, not shining outward but inward, like two wounds in the dark. It didn't move toward me. It only stood, watching, waiting. I staggered backward, but the moment I blinked, the figure melted back into the darkness. I ran until my lungs burned, never daring to look behind me. I don't know what would have happened if the lights hadn't returned in time. I don't want to know, but I do know this. The rules aren't warnings. They're barriers, and each one broken doesn't just risk death. It risks letting something in. The lower decks were supposed to be restricted to maintenance crews, but sometimes research staff passed through to check sensors. I had only been down there once before, when Harris reminded me, Rule 4: never follow footsteps in the lower decks. His tone carried a weight that unsettled me, though I brushed it off as another superstition. The lower levels were colder, quieter, and filled with the constant groaning of metal under the ocean's pressure. Even without strange warnings, the place was eerie enough to make me quicken my pace every time I descended. My chance to test that rule came one night when I was sent down to recalibrate a faulty gauge. The stairwell echoed with each step, the sound thin and hollow as if the walls drank the noise. The further I descended, the more isolated I felt, as though the station above was slipping away. When I reached the deck, my flashlight beam cut across the floor, catching the long shadows of pipes and cables. For a moment, everything was still. Then I heard it, footsteps, not mine, not overlapping, but steady and purposeful, just around the corner. I froze, straining to hear. The steps were too measured to be echoes, too deliberate to be accidents of the structure. My throat tightened as I whispered, "Harris? Anyone?" But no answer came. The footsteps continued, slow and patient, drawing me toward the far end of the deck. Against every instinct, I inched closer, my mind trying to rationalize. Maybe another engineer was down here. Maybe someone had forgotten to log their shift. Yet as I neared the junction, the steps stopped abruptly, replaced by silence, so thick it seemed to vibrate against my ears. My flashlight beam shook as I raised it, sweeping across the corridor. No one was there, just empty steel, valves, and cables hissing faintly with pressure. I told myself I had imagined it, that nerves had played a trick. But then the sound returned behind me this time. Slow, heavy steps, each one deliberate, approaching with the kind of patience that felt worse than a rush. My stomach lurched as I spun around, the light slicing through the shadows, only to reveal an empty hallway once again. The sound had already moved, circling me in the dark. Panic clawed at me, and I tried to retrace my path back to the stairwell. The footsteps followed, not quickening, not rushing, but always behind, always just out of sight. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. For a heartbeat, the steps paused as if listening. Then to my horror, they mimicked me. I heard my own words repeated back, distorted and lower, echoing faintly through the steel. "Who's there?" the voice mocked, carrying a weight that didn't belong to any human throat. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam shaking wildly across the pipes. I reached the stairwell and scrambled upward, 2 steps at a time, my pulse pounding so loudly it drowned the echoing sounds. But halfway up, the steps above me joined in, echoing down from a floor I hadn't reached yet. It was impossible. No one had passed me. No one had gone up. Still, the sound of boots on metal rained down, coming closer, until I swore I could feel the vibration in the handrail beneath my grip. My chest tightened, and I forced myself not to look up, terrified of what I might see staring back. Bursting onto the main deck, I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. For several seconds, I just stood there, breath ragged, ears straining for any sound from below. The footsteps stopped the moment the lock clicked. The silence was almost worse, a reminder that whatever had been down there didn't need to climb stairs. It had simply chosen not to. Harris found me an hour later, still sitting in the corridor, staring at the sealed door. He didn't ask questions. He only said, "You heard them, didn't you?" His voice carried no doubt, just weary resignation. I nodded, too shaken to lie, and he sighed. "They want you to follow," he said quietly. "That's how they catch you. Doesn't matter how far you go, they'll keep leading you deeper until the station itself swallows you." His words made my skin crawl, but the worst part was the way he wouldn't meet my eyes, like he'd already seen too many people disappear into the sound of phantom steps. I wanted to ask him if those people ever came back, but deep down, I already knew the answer. For the rest of the week, I avoided the lower decks entirely, volunteering for surface comms instead. Still at night, lying in my bunk, I swore I could hear faint footsteps traveling through the pipes, rising from below. They were softer now, slower, but patient in a way that suggested time didn't matter. Whatever was waiting in the decks knew I couldn't avoid them forever, and sooner or later, I'd have to go back down. The message came sooner than I hoped. A system alert blinked across the monitors, pressure irregularities in the lower compartments. Someone had to check it. No one volunteered, and after a tense silence, Harris handed me the assignment slip. His expression was grim, but his words were steady. "If you hear them again, don't follow, don't even slow down." He didn't need to remind me. My legs already shook at the thought. That night, armed with a new flashlight and a pounding heart, I descended once again. The stairwell groaned under my weight, and the air grew colder the further I went. I gripped the railing tighter than before, repeating Harris's warning under my breath. At the base, the silence was immediate, as though the station itself was holding its breath. I checked the gauge quickly, forcing myself not to linger. Then I heard it again, the first step, echoing down the hall, patient, certain. My body froze, every instinct screaming to look. The second step followed, closer now, measured and deliberate. I clenched my jaw, refusing to move toward it, refusing to follow, but then something changed. The footsteps multiplied, spreading in every direction at once, circling the deck like a predator surrounding prey. I could no longer tell which way was safe, which path led to the stairs. Every hallway pulsed with the sound of boots on metal, closing in with impossible synchronization. My chest heaved, my flashlight flickering as I turned wildly, searching for escape. And then, just at the edge of the light, I saw it, a shadowy outline at the far end of the corridor, tall and still, waiting. It didn't move, didn't walk, yet the sound of footsteps continued to pour from its direction. My throat tightened as I realized the truth. The steps weren't leading me anywhere, they were luring me. When I first arrived, Harris warned me in a hushed tone. Rule 5, never acknowledge the voices that call you by name. He spoke as if the very act of saying it aloud would invite something into the room. I laughed nervously, pretending it was just another superstition, but his expression stayed flat, grave, and hollow-eyed. Down here, names carry weight, and the wrong thing hearing yours can make it echo forever. At the time, I thought it was just his way of scaring rookies. Later, I learned he hadn't exaggerated a word. The first time it happened, I was alone in the observation lab, logging readings from the sonar array. The hum of the machines was constant, steady, like a heartbeat I'd grown used to. Then woven into the background came a sound I almost missed, a faint voice whispering my name. It was soft, stretched thin by the ocean, but unmistakably mine. My hand stilled over the console, pulse thudding in my ears. I turned instinctively toward the observation glass, half expecting to see someone outside. Of course, there was nothing but black water pressing against the pane. I tried to dismiss it as imagination. Fatigue had been gnawing at me for days, and my brain could have easily conjured a phantom sound. But then the voice came again, clearer this time. It didn't just say my name, it said it the way my mother used to when she was worried. The tone was almost tender, like comfort in the dark. "Stop," I whispered to myself, shaking my head, refusing to look into the shadows beyond the glass. Harris's warning echoed in my skull, and I bit down on my tongue to keep from answering. The voice didn't stop. It grew bolder, layering different tones one after another. Sometimes it was Harris, sometimes it was my old professor, and once it was my own voice calling back at me. Each time, the cadence was just slightly wrong, stretched a little too thin, as though played back through broken speakers. My chest tightened, sweat prickling the back of my neck. I wanted so badly to scream, to tell it to shut up, but I remembered the rule. If I gave it recognition, if I admitted it was real, I didn't know what would happen next. I shut off the console and backed away from the glass, eyes locked on the shifting darkness outside. For a moment the silence returned, and I let myself believe I had imagined it all. Then directly behind me, the voice whispered again, so close it tickled my ear. My heart lurched, and I spun around, but the lab was empty, the door sealed tight. The air felt heavier, pressing down on me like the weight of the ocean itself. I wanted to run, but my legs rooted to the floor, caught between fear and disbelief. The whispers followed me for days after that. In the mess hall, I'd hear them behind the chatter of my colleagues, subtle enough that no one else seemed to notice. In my bunk, they slipped into my dreams, speaking in fragments of memories I hadn't thought about in years. Once in the shower, I swore I heard my father's voice telling me to come closer, as if the drain itself was calling. I started losing sleep, paranoia gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Harris noticed the dark circles under my eyes, but didn't need to ask what was wrong. One evening, he cornered me near the comm station. "You heard them, didn't you?" he asked, voice low but firm. I didn't answer, but my silence was enough. He nodded grimly. "They'll use anyone you've ever trusted. Don't let them in, not even once. If they get acknowledgement, you're marked." I swallowed hard and asked what happened to people who answered. He didn't reply, just gave me a look that was more terrifying than any words. That was when I realized the empty bunks in the crew quarters hadn't always been empty. I began avoiding solitary tasks, sticking close to Harris whenever possible, but even then, the voices tried. During a routine dive in the submersible, I heard my best friend's voice crackle over the intercom, despite the comm line being disconnected. My knuckles went white on the controls as I fought the urge to respond. The voice begged, pleaded, even screamed, but I clenched my jaw and stared ahead into the abyss. When I returned to the station, Harris simply placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Good, you ignored it." But the voices grew more cunning. They began weaving sentences instead of single words, telling me things no one else could know. Childhood secrets, failures, the exact phrasing of arguments I'd had years ago. They spoke with the warmth of my mother, the authority of my teachers, the laughter of my friends. Sometimes they layered over each other, a dozen voices speaking in unison, drowning my thoughts until I couldn't hear my own. My sanity felt like a thread fraying strand by strand. Each night, I wondered how much longer I could resist before breaking. The breaking point came one night when I was alone in my bunk. The voice of my sister, who had died years before, whispered from the dark. "It's me," it said gently. "You don't have to be afraid. Just answer me, please." Tears welled in my eyes as I gripped the sheets, nails digging into the fabric. The urge to say her name, to acknowledge her, burned in my throat. My heart ached with grief, with the longing to believe it was real, just for a moment, but deep down, I knew. My sister was gone. This was something else. I bit my lip until it bled, forcing myself to stay silent. The voice persisted, shifting between anger and pleading, growing louder with each refusal. At last it hissed my name with such venom that the lights in the room flickered. Then abruptly, silence. The air grew cold, and I felt something heavy press against the bunk, like a weight settling beside me. I didn't dare turn my head, didn't dare breathe too loudly. The mattress dipped slightly, and a faint warmth brushed my arm, like the touch of a hand. I stayed frozen until the shift alarm blared, hours later, releasing me from that suffocating stillness. When I finally moved, the sheets where the presence had lain were damp with salt water, as if the ocean itself had been there. I stumbled out of the room, trembling, nearly colliding with Harris in the corridor. One look at me, and he knew what had happened. "It sat with you, didn't it?" he whispered. I didn't ask how he knew. The look in his eyes told me he'd endured the same thing. That day, I learned silence was my only defense. I stopped reacting to anything I heard, no matter how personal, no matter how convincing. Still, the temptation never left. Every time my name drifted through the steel walls, I fought the instinct to answer. The worst part wasn't the fear anymore, it was the doubt. What if just once, the voice really belonged to someone alive, someone who needed me? That thought gnawed at me constantly, tearing at my resolve. And then came the night, when the voice didn't sound like anyone I knew. It wasn't tender, it wasn't pleading, it was cold, ancient, and utterly alien, speaking my name like a possession it already owned. My chest tightened as the room grew impossibly dark, the shadows pulling longer across the walls. I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to acknowledge it, but the pressure in the air deepened, until it felt like the whole station was sinking around me. The station briefing drilled it into us early. Rule 6: always keep one light on, even when you sleep. At first I assumed it was just to fight off claustrophobia, the way dim light makes the pressure of the deep less suffocating. But after my first month below, I realized the rule wasn't for our comfort, it was for our safety. Darkness here isn't the same as topside darkness. It isn't an absence of light, it's a living thing, patient and deliberate, waiting for you to trust it enough to close your eyes. The first night I tested it, I'd been restless and reckless. My bunk lamp was humming faintly, the kind of low electrical buzz that makes it hard to drift off. Irritated, I switched it off, telling myself I'd manage without it. At first nothing happened. The room was pitch black, so complete it felt like the world had ended outside my eyelids. But then the silence shifted. Not broke, not filled, shifted. It was as if the walls around me inhaled, and the air turned heavier, pressing down on my chest with slow, deliberate weight. At the edge of the bunk, I felt movement, not the creak of steel, not the vibration of machinery, something else. It was like the faint dip of a mattress when someone sits beside you. I reached for the switch instinctively, but I couldn't find it. My hand brushed the wall, the sheets, the edge of the frame, but the button I'd flicked a dozen times wasn't there anymore. My skin prickled as the air cooled, and a smell like brine and iron drifted across my face. I knew then I had made a mistake. Suddenly, a faint glow blinked back on. Harris stood at the doorway, holding a portable lantern, his jaw tight with anger. "You turned it off," he said flatly, not even asking. His eyes scanned the room like he expected to see someone else there. I opened my mouth to explain, but he cut me off with a shake of his head. "Don't do it again, ever. You have no idea what almost came through." His words haunted me for nights after, though he never explained further. From then on, I obeyed. The lamp stayed on, even if the bulb flickered or hummed. Some nights, though, I noticed odd things. The shadows didn't always fall where they should. Sometimes the corner of the room stayed darker than it ought to, as if the light didn't dare reach it. Once, half asleep, I swore I saw a shape crouched there, folding in on itself, watching. I blinked, and it vanished. But the pressure in the air lingered until dawn. I didn't mention it to anyone, afraid the station would decide I was losing it. The rule wasn't only for sleeping quarters. In the labs, in the corridors, even in the mess hall, one light always burned, an unspoken ritual the crew enforced without argument. It didn't matter if the bulb was dim, cracked, or buzzing with static interference. As long as light was present, we were safe. But one night during a storm surge, the auxiliary power faltered, lights flickered out across the lower deck, and for a terrifying 20 seconds, the world plunged into absolute blackness. In that moment, I heard something moving, slow, dragging footsteps, just outside the sealed lab doors. When the power returned, nothing was there, but a smear of salt water stretched across the floor, leading nowhere. I remember Harris's pale face as he crouched over it, muttering under his breath, "It got close this time." None of us slept that night. From then on, the crew rotated night watch not to monitor the systems, but to make sure no light ever failed. I realized the truth then. Light wasn't just comfort, it was a barrier. Without it, the trench itself reached inside. I learned to appreciate the smallest glow. My bunk lamp became a lifeline, its faint buzz almost soothing after a while. Still, doubts ate at me. What if the light failed while I was asleep? What if it wasn't strong enough to keep whatever lurked in the shadows at bay? The fear carved into my dreams, twisting them into half-lit corridors where something always moved just out of reach. I woke drenched in sweat, gasping, heart pounding, the glow of the lamp the only anchor keeping me sane. One night, though, the lamp flickered longer than usual. The bulb hissed faintly, dimmed, then flared. My chest tightened as I sat up, staring at it like a dying heartbeat. Then in the brief dip of darkness between flickers, I swore I felt breath against my cheek. Not warm like a human's, cold, damp, and heavy, like the exhale of the deep sea itself. I froze, teeth clenched, as the light surged back. The corner of the room rippled as though water hung in the air. Nothing was visible, but I knew I hadn't been alone. I tried to report it, but Harris cut me off with a sharp glare. "Don't give it attention. Just replace the bulb." His hands trembled slightly as he handed me a spare, and I realized he'd experienced the same thing before. That was when I noticed his bunk. He didn't use a lamp at all. Instead, he kept 4 lanterns positioned around the room, overlapping beams so no shadow could form in the corners. He never spoke about it, but I understood. He hadn't just learned the rule, he was terrified of breaking it again. The longer I stayed, the more I felt the light pulling double duty, not just to keep things out, but to keep me in. Some nights, when fatigue blurred my thoughts, I had the strangest urge to switch the lamp off, like a compulsion whispering in my mind. It wasn't my own desire, it felt foreign, invasive, as if something outside was coaxing me to do it. I would sit up, sweating, staring at the switch while my hand trembled inches away. Only sheer willpower, and the memory of that crushing darkness, kept me from giving in. And then, just a few nights ago, the impossible happened. Despite the lamp burning bright, my room went dark. Not flickering, not dimming. The light still glowed, but the darkness swallowed it whole, leaving me in a black void. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the glow didn't pierce the air around me. The shadows pressed in close, thick and tangible, as if light had no meaning anymore. My heart hammered as I reached for the door, but the handle was ice cold, unyielding, like it had been sealed shut from the outside. In the silence, I heard movement again. Slow, deliberate steps circling the bunk. I couldn't see, couldn't scream, could only listen as the sound drew closer. Then a hand brushed my shoulder, clammy and heavy, pressing me down into the mattress. My breath caught in my throat, body rigid, too afraid to move. Just as I thought the pressure would crush me, the glow snapped back, the light reclaiming the room. The presence vanished, but the sheets where I lay were soaked in salt water. That night, I understood the rule fully. Light wasn't just protection, it was permission to exist in this place. Without it, the ocean claimed you, and now I can't shake the thought, if the dark found a way to smother the glow once, it can do it again. I learned quickly that the station had one law harsher than all the others. Rule 7. Never swim outside the station alone. To the untrained, it might sound like common sense. Diving into the trench without a partner, is suicide even in perfect conditions. But the rule was more than safety protocol. It was survival carved into tradition. The first time I heard it, I thought of air tanks, tangled lines, and pressure malfunctions. Later I realized the rule wasn't about equipment. It was about what waits in the dark when it senses you're isolated. The temptation came during a maintenance shift. A faulty sensor had jammed near the eastern pylon, and I volunteered to check it. Harris insisted he'd come with me, but he was still nursing an injured wrist from a previous dive. "It's a quick fix," I argued, strapping on the suit, ignoring the tightness in his jaw. I convinced myself I didn't need anyone watching my back. As soon as I cleared the airlock, the ocean swallowed me whole. The silence out there is never empty. It's thick, crushing, and endless. At first, it was calm. My headlamp carved a narrow beam into the void, catching drifts of silt and flashes of alien life brushing past. The sensor hung crooked, a simple repair, just as I'd expected. But as I worked, I felt it. A pull in the water, a pressure that wasn't from the depth alone. My pulse quickened as I turned, sweeping my light in wide arcs. That's when I realized the beam didn't extend as far as it should have. The dark seemed to swallow it, shrinking the world around me until I felt like I was drifting in a sealed chamber. Then I saw movement, not a fish, not a shadow. It was larger, gliding just beyond the reach of my lamp. My first thought was shark, but it was too deep for them. My second was submersible, but no engines hummed. It circled me once, slow and deliberate, then vanished again. My breathing rasped loud in my helmet as I tried to steady myself, every instinct screaming to return. But I hadn't finished the repair, and the stubborn part of me clung to the task. I tightened the last bolt with trembling fingers, every nerve alive with dread. That's when the comm crackled. At first I thought it was Harris breaking in, despite the link being dormant, but the voice wasn't his. It was my own. "Don't turn around," it whispered, distorted, soaked in static. My chest seized, every muscle frozen, slowly against my better judgment. I pivoted anyway, and there it was, just feet away, a shape mirroring my suit, my movements, my exact frame. The helmet glass was black, but something pulsed faintly inside, like bioluminescence behind flesh. I gasped, my breath fogging the visor, as it tilted its head in perfect sync with mine. Panic took over. I shoved off the pylon and kicked toward the station, every stroke frantic, clumsy, desperate. The water dragged at me like syrup, slowing me down, but when I dared a glance back, the thing hadn't moved. It just hovered, watching, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. I didn't look again until I crashed into the airlock, slamming my fist against the release. The chamber flooded with sterile light as the door sealed behind me. My knees buckled when gravity returned, helmet clattering as I ripped it off. I sucked air like I'd been drowning. Harris was waiting. He said nothing, just looked at me, then at the timer on the console. "You were outside for too long," he muttered. Finally, I tried to explain what I saw, but he cut me short with a single raised hand. "That's why the rule exists. Alone you're a target. They mimic you, tempt you, surround you, until you're not sure which body belongs to you anymore." His tone was grim, almost hollow, like he was remembering something he refused to share. I realized then he hadn't asked if I'd seen anything. He already knew I had. From that night on, I understood the terror of solitude in the deep. Even walking the empty corridors made my skin crawl, the memory of that reflection burning in my mind. During later dives, I refused to leave the station without Harris or another crew member by my side. And yet the trench seemed to sense my weakness. I'd catch glimpses of my silhouette in the observation glass where no reflection should exist. Once as I floated in the lab, I saw my own figure drifting just beyond the viewport, watching with folded arms. When I blinked, it was gone. It escalated weeks later. A fellow biologist named Grant insisted on taking a solo dive, mocking our fears as superstition. We argued, but he left anyway, suit gleaming under the floodlights as he disappeared into the void. At first his comms fed back normal readings, his laughter tinged with arrogance. Then his voice shifted. It deepened, warped, and began repeating only one phrase. I found myself. The channel cut out. We never saw him again, though sometimes the sonar pinged a human-shaped return circling the station at night. Harris refused to discuss it, but I knew it was him, or something wearing him. After that, no one questioned the rule. Doubt had no place in survival anymore. Still, I can't shake the memory of what I saw out there, the way it mirrored me, the way it waited. It wasn't hunting in the normal sense. It was patient, studying, almost curious. The thought claws at my mind in sleepless hours. What if someday one of us lets it follow back inside? And worse, what if it already has, and we just haven't noticed? They told me early on, Rule 8, if you hear knocking on the hull, do not answer. At first I laughed, thinking it was another psychological warning, a trick to keep paranoia in check. Harris leaned close and said, laugh all you want, but when the trench knocks back, you'll regret ever mocking it. His tone silenced me. In a station that creaks and groans under the weight of 7 miles of water, sounds become an obsession. Every echo feels like a message. And sometimes, those messages knock. The first time it happened to me was during a graveyard shift in the observation deck. I was alone, monitoring plankton readings, while the others slept. The ocean outside was pitch black, only disturbed by the faint glow of a drifting jellyfish. Then came the sound, 3 dull thuds, perfectly spaced, reverberating through the steel. My chest tightened as the glass trembled slightly under the vibration. I froze, hands hovering above the console, whispering to myself, it's nothing, just settling metal. But deep down, I knew no machine could mimic a rhythm like that. I tried to ignore it, to drown the sound beneath the hum of the station. But the knocking returned, this time 5 beats. Slower, deliberate. My throat went dry. Against every instinct, I leaned closer to the viewport, eyes straining into the abyss. That's when I thought I saw movement, a pale hand brushing the glass before vanishing into the dark. My heart thudded in sync with the sound, sweat prickling my neck. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't work. It was as if the trench itself had reached out and tapped a finger against my skull. Later, when I told Harris, he didn't look surprised. He just muttered, "You lasted longer than I did before hearing it." I pressed him for answers, but he shook his head. They test you. First the knocks, then the shapes, then the whispers. The mistake everyone makes is answering. I frowned. Answering? How? He gave me a cold look and said, "By knocking back." The way he said it made my stomach churn, as if knocking was less of a reply and more of an invitation. A week passed before the trench tested me again. I was with Grant and Elena in the lab when the sound came. 2 slow knocks, each one vibrating through the floor. Elena dropped her beaker, glass shattering, and muttered, "Not again." Grant, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "It's pressure shifts. You people act like ghosts live out there." Before we could stop him, he rapped twice on the hull with his knuckles, grinning like a child playing a game. The silence afterward was unbearable. Even the hum of machinery seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if mocking him, the answer came. 4 knocks this time, sharp and furious, rattling the walls so hard the lights flickered. Elena screamed, clutching my arm. Grant's smile vanished. That's not possible," he stammered, backing away. We didn't sleep that night. None of us dared leave the lab until the knocking stopped hours later. When we confronted Harris, he only said, "He invited them. Pray they don't accept." Grant brushed it off, but I noticed the way his hands shook for days afterward. Things changed after that. Whenever Grant passed a viewport, I'd catch him glancing sideways, as though something stared back. Once during a routine dive, his comms picked up a faint tapping sound, steady, relentless, echoing through his mic. "It's following me," he whispered in terror, before cutting his feed. When we hauled him back inside, his suit was intact, but his eyes were hollow. He refused to speak of what he'd heard, but he stopped mocking the rule. He also stopped sleeping alone. I wasn't so lucky. One night, while resting in my cabin, the knocking returned. This time, it was softer, gentler, almost coaxing. 3 taps, then silence. I buried my head beneath the blanket, trembling, but the sound persisted. My hands itched to knock back, to prove to myself it was just my imagination. The urge was maddening, a compulsion that clawed at my sanity. I gritted my teeth and whispered, "You're not real, you're not there." But in the stillness, I swore I heard a faint voice through the metal whisper, "Then let me in." After that, I avoided solitude at all costs. I begged for extra shifts, shared quarters, anything to keep from hearing that dreadful sound again. But the trench is patient. During a blackout, the power flickered out and the station sank into total darkness. That's when the knocking came again, furious this time, pounding from every side, as though hundreds of fists beat against the walls. Elena wailed, covering her ears, while Harris barked orders to restore power. The sound grew louder, deafening, until I thought the hull would crack. Then, just as the lights returned, it stopped. Absolute silence. We don't talk about it much anymore. Grant keeps to himself, avoiding every viewport. Elena mutters prayers under her breath, whenever the pipes creak, and me. I can't forget the whisper that followed the last round of knocking. Just before it stopped, faint but clear, I heard my own voice echo back from the steel. "Next time you'll answer." They warned us early on. Rule 9, never dive alone after midnight. It sounded like a superstition, the kind of warning divers tell rookies to scare them into following protocol. But Harris told me there was truth behind it. "Things hunt differently when the clock strikes 12 down here," he muttered, avoiding my gaze. "The Mariana Trench doesn't care about time, but the human mind does. Midnight feels heavier in the deep, as if the ocean itself resets and wakes something that doesn't belong in the world above. The first time I tested that rule, it wasn't by choice. A system failure on the external sensors forced us into an emergency dive at 12:14 a.m. I drew the short straw. Grant offered to come with me, but Harris insisted it was safer to send just one person tethered to the station. My pulse raced as I sealed myself into the suit, the silence pressing in as the airlock hissed open. Darkness swallowed me instantly, and the only sound was my own breathing echoing inside the helmet. I told myself it would be a quick fix, but the trench never makes things quick. The tether stretched behind me, glowing faintly in the artificial lights as I drifted into the abyss. Every movement felt exaggerated, every sound amplified. I reached the sensor tower and began running diagnostics when I noticed something strange. The water around me wasn't still, it was pulsing, rippling, as if stirred by some vast unseen presence. My comm crackled, and Elena's voice whispered, "Don't look down." My blood froze. I hadn't told her I was looking, but my gaze had already shifted, and below me, far beneath the suit lights, a shape moved, long, sinuous, impossibly large. I shut my eyes, forcing myself to focus on the task. The sensor light blinked red, demanding calibration, but my hands trembled so badly the controls slipped from my grasp. I heard it then, the sound of something dragging against the tether line. At first I thought it was a current, but when I glanced back, I saw the glowing cord vibrating, as though a hand or something shaped like one was brushing along it. My chest heaved, panic clawing at my lungs. "Harris," I whispered through the comm, "something's out here." His reply was instant, sharp, "Do not talk to it. Finish and come back." I tried. God, I tried. But then came the voice, soft at first like water rushing through pipes, but then clearer. It wasn't Harris. It wasn't Elena. It was my own voice, repeating in a perfect mimic, "Stay, just a little longer." My hands shook violently as I forced the last calibration into place, praying for the green light. When it finally blinked, I bolted back along the tether, pulling myself with frantic jerks. The water shifted again, something enormous, following just beyond the edge of my helmet light. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I stumbled back into the airlock, Elena yanked off my helmet, eyes wide. "You're pale as death," she whispered. I tried to laugh it off, but Harris silenced me with a glare. "You broke the rule," he said, almost accusingly. "You went alone after midnight." I protested that I hadn't chosen to, but he only shook his head. "Doesn't matter, it knows you now." I didn't ask what he meant. The look in his eyes told me enough. In the days that followed, I began to notice changes. Shadows clung to the corners of the station, darker than they should be. My dreams filled with rushing water and voices that sounded like mine but weren't. Sometimes I'd wake to find condensation inside my helmet, as though I had been wearing it in my sleep. Once I swore I saw wet footprints leading away from the airlock, though no one else admitted to using it that night. Harris said nothing, but I caught him watching me with the same wary expression one uses for a ticking bomb. Grant, restless and skeptical as always, decided to challenge the rule himself. One night, just before 1 a.m., he suited up without telling anyone and slipped out. By the time we realized he was gone, the tether showed he was already 200 meters down. We tried calling him back, but his comms carried only static and faint whispers. Elena clutched my arm, trembling. "He's not alone down there." Her words made me shiver because I already knew it was true. When the tether finally jerked violently, reeling as though something had pulled it, we scrambled to reel him back. What we pulled in wasn't Grant. The suit was intact, but the helmet was empty, the inside dripping with seawater. A faint echo lingered in the comm unit, a distorted version of his voice whispering, "Still here." Elena screamed and fled the room, while Harris cut the tether with shaking hands. His face was pale, his lips trembling as he muttered, "That's why you never dive alone after midnight." We didn't speak of it again, but the suit remained sealed in storage, a silent reminder of what waits in the dark. Since that night, I've never once volunteered for a midnight dive, but sometimes, during inspections or emergencies, the thought creeps into my mind. What if I hear that voice again? What if it asks me to stay? Worse, what if the next time, it doesn't ask, it commands? I don't think my willpower could resist, and the trench knows it. That's the worst part. Midnight isn't just time down here, it's an invitation, one I already answered once without meaning to. I fear the next time, I won't be able to come back. They told me from the start, Rule 10, do not follow the lights. Outside the station. At first, I assumed it referred to bioluminescent creatures, the way fish and plankton shimmer in the abyss. But Harris made it clear it was something else entirely. "The trench has ways of luring you out," he said grimly, "and lights are only the beginning." I didn't fully believe him, not until the first time I saw those glowing orbs drifting past the viewport, moving with a rhythm too precise to be natural. The lights appeared during my third week on night watch. At first, I thought they were a school of lanternfish, their tiny bodies blinking in synchronization. But as I leaned closer to the glass, I realized these weren't scattered like fish. They were aligned, forming a perfect arc, curving slowly toward the station. My heart skipped as they pulsed brighter, almost beckoning. Then I noticed something worse. They weren't drifting randomly. They were stopping, pausing in place, as if waiting for me to react. I whispered, "Elena, do you see this?" But when she hurried over, the lights were gone. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling I'd been watched. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself fatigue was making me hallucinate. But 2 days later, the lights returned. This time, they formed a straight line, stretching into the distance like a glowing path. They seemed so deliberate, so inviting. I felt my body lean toward the viewport, as though pulled. Harris stormed in before I could lose myself completely. He grabbed my shoulder hard and snarled, "Don't ever stare too long. That's how it gets in your head." The fury in his eyes was worse than the lights themselves. Grant, of course, mocked us for being superstitious. "It's just plankton clusters," he said with a smirk. "You people act like ghosts are flying out there." One night, when the lights appeared again, he decided to prove his point. Before we could stop him, He suited up and marched to the airlock. Alina screamed at him, begging him not to go, but he laughed. "If glowing fish are the worst this trench has to offer, I'll be fine." Then he was gone, stepping into the abyss, with nothing but those shimmering orbs to guide him. We watched from the viewport as his helmet light vanished into the dark, swallowed by the path of glowing orbs. At first, we could still hear him over comms. "It's beautiful out here," he whispered. "They're surrounding me now. I think they want me to follow." Harris barked at him to turn back, but Grant ignored him, his voice dreamy, almost intoxicated. "It feels like they're showing me something." Just a little further, then came silence, followed by a low crackle of static. His tether went slack, and the lights blinked out all at once. When we pulled the line back, the suit was gone. Not cut, not torn, gone, as if it had dissolved into the trench. Alina sobbed uncontrollably, clutching Harris's arm. He looked at me, his face pale, and said, "Now you understand why the rule exists." That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed Grant's last words, the way his voice shifted from excitement to reverence, as though the lights weren't just luring him, they were choosing him. And what terrified me most was the way he seemed grateful in the end. Days passed, and I tried to bury the memory, but the trench doesn't forget. One evening, while checking readings alone, the lights returned. They floated just outside the glass, no more than a dozen, pulsing in perfect unison. This time, they didn't form a path. They formed a circle directly in front of my viewport. My chest tightened as they brightened, brighter and brighter, until they were all I could see. And then faintly, I thought I saw faces inside them. Grant's face, Alina's parents, even my brother's smile, all flickering within the glow. I stumbled back, whispering, "That's not real," but the lights pulsed harder, as if mocking me. I wanted to scream, to alert the others, but some instinct told me if I made a sound, the lights would push through the glass. So I stayed still, frozen, until finally they dimmed and drifted away. When Harris found me an hour later, I was trembling so hard I couldn't speak. He didn't ask what I'd seen. He already knew. Instead, he handed me a flask of bitter coffee and said, "You lasted. That's more than most." His calmness scared me more than the lights ever could. It meant he'd seen them too, maybe too many times. Since then, I've avoided the viewports at night, covering them with whatever I can. Alina does the same, though sometimes I catch her staring at the dark, as if waiting. The lights haven't returned in days, but I know they're still out there, waiting for me to look again, waiting for me to open the airlock and follow. I keep hearing Grant's voice in my dreams, soft and beckoning. "It's beautiful out here, come and see." And I fear one night, I won't be able to resist. Of all the warnings, Harris always lingered longest on this one. Rule 11. When you hear your name in the dark, do not answer. He didn't joke, didn't soften the words. He said it like a curse, something etched into the steel of the station itself. At first, I thought it meant paranoia, the mind playing tricks under pressure. But he shook his head and whispered, "The trench knows us. It calls us, and once you answer, it never stops." The look in his eyes haunted me more than the rule itself. The first time it happened to me, I was half asleep in my bunk. A faint sound stirred me, like distant current rushing through the hall. Then through the silence, I heard it, my name, spoken softly, perfectly, as if someone I trusted had leaned into the room. "Daniel." My throat tightened. I sat upright, glancing around, but the others were still asleep. I wanted to call back, to ask who was there, but something heavy pressed against my chest, warning me not to. I clenched my teeth, heart racing, until the sound faded into silence. I tried to convince myself it was a dream, but the next night it returned. This time, the voice was clearer, closer, coming from the ventilation shaft above my bed. "Daniel, I need you." It sounded like Elena. I almost answered, the words forming on my lips, before I caught Harris's shadow in the doorway. He didn't speak, just raised a finger to his lips, his face pale as death. The voice repeated my name 3 more times before fading, each repetition heavier, more insistent. When it stopped, Harris whispered, "That's how it begins. You hear it once, then twice, then forever." After that, I couldn't escape it. During shifts, whispers echoed through the pipes. In the observation deck, I'd hear my name drift across the speakers, faint, as though carried from the abyss outside. Sometimes it sounded like my mother. Other times it mimicked Grant's voice, even though he was gone. The worst was when it used my own voice. One night, while checking readings, the comm unit crackled to life with a perfect copy of me whispering, "Daniel, look outside." I nearly broke the console in panic, slamming the power off. My own voice still echoed in my ears, long after the silence returned. Elena confessed she'd heard her name too. She said it started softly, then grew angrier each time she ignored it. "Last night," she whispered, trembling. "It screamed. It was right beside my bed." Her eyes glistened with tears as she added, "I almost answered. God help me, I almost answered." Harris pulled her aside, speaking in hushed tones I couldn't hear, but I saw the fear in his face. Even he, the one who seemed unshakable, was cracking under the weight of the voices. The pressure came to its breaking point during a midnight blackout. The station plunged into total darkness, every system failing at once. I sat frozen in my bunk, unable to see even my own hands. That's when I heard it again. My name, whispered from every direction at once. "Daniel." The sound vibrated through the steel, echoed inside my skull, resonated with the beat of my heart. My lips moved before I could stop them. I almost answered. My teeth clenched, blood filling my mouth where I bit my tongue to hold back. The voice grew sharper, furious, as if aware of my defiance. Suddenly, the sound shifted. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a chorus, dozens of voices overlapping, all calling my name in perfect unison. My skin prickled as the air turned icy cold. I heard footsteps along the corridor, slow and deliberate, stopping outside my cabin. Then in a voice that was both mine and not mine, it said, "Open the door." My body shook uncontrollably, every instinct screaming to obey. But I stayed still, teeth gritted, until the lights flickered back on. When I finally looked, the corridor was empty. The voices never stopped after that. Day and night, awake or asleep, I hear them. Sometimes they plead, sometimes they laugh, sometimes they cry. But always, always, they say my name. Elena has stopped eating, her face pale and gaunt, because she says every bite of food now carries whispers. Harris avoids eye contact, his hands trembling whenever the comm unit flickers. He won't admit it, but I know he hears his name too. And I wonder how long until one of us breaks, until someone finally answers. Last night, as I stood in the observation deck, the abyss pressed against the glass, I heard the voice again, softer this time, almost tender. "Daniel." For the first time I felt an almost overwhelming urge to respond, to end the torment by giving in. My throat opened, breath catching in my chest, but then I saw something move in the dark beyond the glass, something massive, shapeless, waiting. I froze, the word dying in my throat, and the voice laughed, a low, terrible sound that rattled my bones. Now I know the truth. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were survival prayers, fragile walls against something the trench has always harbored. 11 rules to keep the dark at bay. 11 rules to stop the ocean from remembering your name. I fear I won't hold out much longer. And when I finally break, when I finally answer, I know the trench won't just take me. It will take everything. Because tonight, as I write this, I can already hear it again. Louder, closer, my own voice whispering from the other side of the glass. "Daniel, it's time." If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.